I'm your first speaker today, Mark Adair. I'm from Mason Hayes & Curran Lawyers in Dublin, and I'm also going to be introducing my friends up here on stage, but I've got the pleasure of the first talk, and I see the countdown timer has already started, so we'll get into it. I'm a technology, cloud computing, and fintech lawyer based in Dublin. I also do a lot of work in data protection, so that's going to form a big chunk of the talk today. I wanted to start off with a quote. Gary Keane from Harvard University said that big data is not about the data. But what does he mean? Because, of course, big data must be about the data. Well, as you've probably heard today, and as many of the other speakers will have said to you, the value of big data is actually in the data analytics and the outputs and the patterns and what we can garner from the outputs of the big data. And I think it's useful to take a step back. So if we think, what is fintech? Fintech is simply financial services technology or technology applied to financial services. It can be anything from peer-to-peer funding to foreign exchange transactions to mobile and e-commerce payments. So it's a really broad definition that encompasses a lot of services and technologies and apps that we see today. And in fintech, we're seeing an increasing use of big data, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, specifically the legal requirements and data protection requirements. And of course, we all know what big data is. You've heard about it all day. You'll hear about it all day tomorrow. Big data is taking old data sets, lots and lots of data, old data sets, using computer analysis on that data, looking at the outputs to spot patterns and associations, and then using that data to increase value for your fintech or your IoT organization. Some statistics that I think are absolutely incredible, and I got these from the IBM website. We create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day, and a quintillion is 1 followed by 18 zeros if you're in the US. If you're in the UK, it's 1 followed by 30 zeros. But as it's from the IBM website, I think we can be certain that we're talking about US. Still, an enormous amount of data every single day. And 90% of the data in the world today was created in the last 2 years. Now, just think about that for a second. The internet's been around since, what, the late 1970s, 1980s, depending on your definition. Google's been around since 1998. Facebook's been around since 2004, 2005. But we're talking about the last 2 years, 90% of all the data ever created. It's absolutely remarkable. And obviously, as lawyers, we see that as a benefit for clients, but also it creates a lot of risk. And there's different ways that a fintech or an IoT company can apply big data. They can use it to group customers into different segments, and that allows them to identify opportunities for new products and new services, and it also allows them to optimize their pricing and hopefully increase the bottom line. Big data can also be used in the back end, so the non-customer-facing side of things, to manage existing risks. So two that come to mind are spotting outlier transactions, so looking at the patterns of the big data to hopefully predict and be able to stop a cybersecurity breach happening or fraud. And it can also be used if we're talking about a fintech and they're providing credit or some sort of financial loan to a customer to validate the creditworthiness decision of the customer. So you think of the big data, you've got a lot more data about customers today than you would have had 5, 10, 20 years ago. So remember, 90% of data is created in the last 2 years. So all of this data will allow your fintech company to make better decisions about creditworthiness. So I think we can break down the legal risks into two different buckets. We've got what I call the traditional legal risks. So these are legal risks that are probably in many, many technology transactions. And we've also got the big data specific legal risks. So the traditional legal risks are ones that you'll see in many, many different sorts of contracts. Confidentiality. So if you are a fintech or an IoT company, have you actually got the right to use that big data? Have you, using that big data, is that going to breach any NDA or any implied legal right? Data protection and privacy, an absolutely enormous area that I could spend 5 hours talking about, but I absolutely don't want to put you to sleep. So I'm just going to touch on some of the main topics in relation to big data. The first is that if we've got these big sets of data and we're bringing them in from different sources, do we have the customer's consent to use that data for the analysis and the outputs that we're going to do on it with the big data? There's a principle under Irish and EU data protection law that you have to, it's called purpose limitation. So essentially, you can't use data for a different purpose that's incompatible with the original purpose for which the data was collected. The second point is to do with fair processing. Do you have the customer's consent to process that data? And if you don't, then you may need to go back and get the customer's consent again, which, as you can imagine, is an expensive and time-consuming process. We've also got brand new European laws coming into force in relation to data protection in 2018. It's called the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's really going to change everything. Some of the highlights under the GDPR are that a breach of the GDPR can cost the company up to 4% of its annual turnover. Fintech companies or IoT companies using big data of a certain size will have to hire a data protection officer. And finally, the GDPR applies on a pan-European basis, so that a company based in Ireland will be regulated and the same law will apply as a company based in Germany or France. Data security is obviously very important as well. As a company dealing with big data, the law today states that you have to have appropriate security measures in place. And if you're outsourcing or using a third-party supplier, you need to flow that obligation down to your suppliers. And I don't need to tell you that practically you should have the best security that your company can afford. The specific legal risks in relation to big data, I think there's 3 different types here. If you're pulling data from different sources, so remember we said big data is essentially old data sets. Do you have the appropriate license to use that data, to process it, and to use the outputs? If not, you need to make sure that's in place, or there may be a lawsuit coming from the actual owner of the data. What about the actual outputs and the intellectual property? So the actual ownership in the outputs of the big data, so the analysis. Do you have appropriate documentation in place so that you own that data and that you're going to onward license that to customers or to other suppliers? You need to make sure that's documented and in place. And finally, competition law. Now, this is going to be an ever-increasing area. Sorry, this is going to be an ever-increasing legal risk in the area of big data. The competition authorities are taking an increasing interest in big data sets used by banks and larger fintech companies who are merging or striking up alliances. And essentially, what the regulators don't want is the big data being used or many big data sets coming together in a way that's anti-competitive or a cartel. And it's something that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Artificial intelligence is going to be an increasingly important area in big data. This is the part of the talk where we, as lawyers, may be put out of business because we might be getting robot or automated lawyers doing all our contracts. So I don't like to talk about it too much. But joking aside, it is going to be important. So if a fintech is making creditworthiness decisions about customers, the law today, if we take an example of the UK, the law today says that the customer has to be informed that automated decision-making is being used, that the customer gives their consent for that automated decision, and the customer is able to get the automated decision referred to a human to review. And you might think, well, that's a pretty strange thing for lawmakers to say, because that slows down the process. That takes all the good away from artificial intelligence. But I think the lawmakers and the regulators are trying to strike a balance between protecting the data protection rights of individuals on one side, and on the other side, making sure that companies who are using the big data are able to use it efficiently and able to use it for their business. And it's a very hard balance to strike. And my view, personally, is that I don't think they struck it correctly, because I think it's probably slanted too far in favor of the customer, probably because artificial intelligence and automated decision-making is new, and the regulators and lawmakers haven't quite come to terms with it yet. But we may see under the GDPR, which does mention artificial intelligence, so that's the new European regulation that's coming in 2 years' time. It is mentioned, and it is going to be something that I think companies on one side and regulators on the other side will have to look at and grapple with. So to sum up, where's big data going from here? So I want you to take two things away from the talk today. The first is that there's great benefits in using big data and the data analytics for fintechs and Internet of Things companies, but there's also real legal risks, like we discussed, the traditional legal risks and the specific legal risks. And those risks are multiplying as the volume of data collected grows. So as more and more data gets collected, the risks of companies is increasing. There's three things you can do, and you need to discuss this with your lawyers, but there's three things that you should be doing and thinking about to make sure that your collection of big data and your analysis of those big data outputs is in compliance with law. The first is to make sure that all your paperwork is in place, so your privacy policies, your data consent forms, and your contracts have to be watertight. You have to make sure that you are obtaining consents properly and that customers are informed of how you're using their data and what you're going to be using it for, if it's for a different purpose. The second is that you need to make sure that you've got consents in place, and if you haven't, you need to go back and look at those consents to make sure that they're in place. You may need to go out and get new consents. And the final thing that I want to leave with you today is we've talked about this new European law, the GDPR, that's coming in. It has a principle called privacy by design. You need to make sure that your engineers in your companies understand what privacy by design means. It means that your company has to take privacy seriously. And as one of our clients put it, it needs to make sure that privacy is in the DNA of your company. So make sure that you've got your consents in place, that you've got your paperwork in place, and that your company adheres to the privacy by design. I'd like to thank you for listening, and unfortunately we don't have time for questions today, but my details are on the screen, so if anybody wants to give me an email or give me a call or connect with me on Twitter, I'd be happy to discuss with you or answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.